This week, we're going to take a break from the mini series on the survey and scanning project we've been looking at for the past month and talk about something I haven't brought up to date. How does a single scan's point density setting within the scanner itself affect the usability of the final compiled point cloud? Most terrestrial scanners give you the option to change what density of points are captured at each scan that are often denoted as a point spacing at a benchmark distance. For example, a high density setting for a particular scanner may capture a point every 3 millimeters at a distance of 10 meters away from the scanner, whereas the low density setting may capture a point every 12 millimeters at the same distance. You can usually just leave the point density setting alone at the default setting and obtain satisfactory results, but are you obtaining optimal results? Are you being as efficient as possible? Today, we'll start to unravel some of the factors you may want to consider when altering these settings to save time in the field and office, yet still be able to extract all necessary data from the final point cloud. To help answer some of the questions I had when exploring the various factors one should consider, I ran a series of test scans on the facade of a motel I recently stayed at on an out-of-town scan job. I captured 3 datasets, all sharing the same 18 scan positions. Each dataset was captured using the Leica RTC 360 on either the low, medium, or high density scan setting. The 18 scan positions were made up from 2 rows. In the first row, each scan was 10 meters or 30 feet from the face of the building, with 10 meters between each scan position, and the second row was 20 meters or 60 feet from the building, again with 10 meters separating each scan position. When processing the data, I made 3 datasets for each data setting. One with just the front row of scans, one with just the back row, and one where I combined the 2 rows. This gave me a total of 9 processed point clouds. We'll start off by exploring the most obvious factor one should consider when choosing a density setting: field acquisition time. The difference in field scan time isn't as black and white as simply comparing the listed scan times of each setting. Let's look at Leica's RTC 360 to explore what I mean here. The RTC 360's user manual estimated scan times for each point density setting when images aren't taken, so the points won't have true RGB values associated with them, are as follows. 25 seconds with the low setting, which gives you a 12 millimeter resolution at 10 meters. 50 seconds with the medium setting, which gives you a 6 millimeter resolution at 10 meters, and 100 seconds with the high setting, which gives you a 3 millimeter resolution at 10 meters. If we want HDR images to colorize the points and create a 360-degree panorama imagery, we need to add 60 seconds to each scan. However, these estimated scan times only include actual scanning time, not the time it takes for the scanner to think before and after each scan. In my testing, I clocked a low density scan is taking 61 seconds from the moment I pressed the start button to the moment I could pick up the scanner and start walking around to the next scan position. The medium took 86 seconds and the high took 136 seconds. There was a very consistent 36 seconds across the board for the scanner to think that is essentially lost production time. With that in mind, to calculate how many scans per hour each setting is capable of, assuming it takes 15 seconds to pick up the scanner, walk to the next scan position, and start the next scan, which was the average in my testing for scan positions separated by 10 meters or 30 feet, we get the following results. For low density scans with the RTC 360 without imagery, we can perform about 47 scans per hour. For medium density scans, we can perform about 36 scans per hour. And for the high density scans, we can perform about 24 scans per hour. If we want colorized points and panorama imagery, those production values reduce to 27 scans per hour for low density, 22 scans per hour for medium density, and 17 scans per hour for high density. At first glance, when looking at the estimated scan times in the manufacturer provided user manual, it looks like the acquisition time should be double for medium compared to low and doubled again from high compared to medium. But when we take the other factors into consideration that affect productivity time, the outlook changes. Low isn't twice as fast as medium, it's about 32% faster without imagery and 19% faster with imagery. And medium is about 50% faster than high without imagery and about 30% faster with imagery. While there is still a considerable difference in acquisition time, it's not as stark as it looked at first glance. There is a fairly linear relationship between the file size of the raw scan data and the point density settings of the scanner. Looking at the example datasets I ran on the building facade, the low density scans had a total file size of 731 megabytes. The medium density scans were 2630 megabytes, or about 4 times the size of low, and the high density scans were 9790 megabytes, or about 4 times the file size of medium, and 16x the low density dataset. This makes sense because the point density of medium is 4x that of low, and high is 4x that of medium. While 6 millimeters of the medium setting is only double 12 millimeters of the low setting, that's only looking at one axis, and since point density resolution is affected by two axes, we must double the points again. For example, in 1 square meter 10 meters away from the scanner, we can expect to have about 6,944 points under the 12 millimeter density setting, but at the 6 millimeter density setting, we should have about 27,778 points. Why does this quadrupling of file size matter? Well, there's a few reasons. It's good practice to catalog the raw scan data for each job scanned for a period of time. That period of time may change between companies and jobs, but data storage can start to get expensive fast when we're talking about a single crew creating over 100 gigabytes of raw data per day. If you have 10 crews out scanning, we're looking at a terabyte of data per day. We can get into hundreds of terabytes pretty quickly, and this is just the raw data. Besides the cost of data storage, arguably the bigger issue of raw data file size is file transfer time. The difference in file size for an equal number of scans between the high and low setting is about 16x. So for example, if I performed a day of scanning with the low density setting without imagery, I could end up with a file size of say 25 gigabytes, but if I scanned the exact same site with the same setups under the high density setting, I could be looking at a file size of 400 gigabytes. And if you need to transfer that data over the internet, say to a server, remote processing computer, or cloud service, you could be looking at a significant amount of time lost uploading the data, then downloading it again onto the processing computer. A good example of this impact would be in the multi-part miniseries I've been working on, where in episode 3 I bring up the fact that the data only made it to 40% upload completion after 8 hours when I tried to send the data to the cloud so I could start processing before I had to leave my hotel and travel back home. And due to that failed upload, I lost an entire day of registration time on a project that already had a tight schedule. On other larger projects I've been on, it's been such an issue it actually made more logistical sense to transfer the raw data to physical portable hard drives and overnight mail them to the office for processing. Exported compiled point cloud file size is not as big of an issue because decimation of the final point cloud is an option when exporting data from most processing softwares. On a quick side note on the topic of decimation, one benefit of higher density scan settings is that when you do decimate an overly dense cloud, it allows you to even out the final point cloud spacing. Since laser scan density is directly correlated to the distance from the scanner, you end up with very dense data close to the scanner that gets more and more sparse as you move away from the scanner. So you could end up with several million points per square meter right beside the scanner, but maybe only a few thousand per square meter on, say, a high roof 30 meters away. Decimating the cloud will help to even out this disparity and create a final export with much better uniformity in terms of point spacing. The time it takes to process a data set will obviously be significantly impacted by the file size of the raw data that needs to be registered. But file size is just one of the many factors that make up the equation that determines processing time. What hardware is being used, what software is being used, the amount of overlap between scans, was imagery taken, where the raw data is being stored during processing, scan position link complexity, registration settings, the list goes on and on. While the amount of time the computer takes to process the data may be very important to some, it may not be as big a factor to others. For example, when I remote into a dedicated processing computer and simply need to click a few buttons to start registering the data, where I can then let it work for hours or days while I get back to working in the field, it doesn't really affect me too much. But for someone that is trying to process the data and only has one computer to work with that will essentially be out of commission during the registration process, this can have a major impact on productivity. Either way, all other factors being equal, raw data file size does have a major impact on processing time. How much that impact will affect you and your team will need to be assessed when making the decision of what density to scan at in the field. So far, we focus on factors that mostly affect the time it takes to capture and work with the data. Let's pivot to look at feature extraction of the data, starting off with the size of the features you're trying to extract. If you need to model a 1 inch or 2.5 centimeter conduit in an electrical room, it can be very difficult to accurately extract the size and shape of that conduit if the final point cloud only has a point every half inch or 1 centimeter. However, if you're trying to extract the wall of a building, that same point spacing may be more than enough. Going back to the test datasets, we can see while there is a large disparity between the densest dataset, the front row and the rear row combined under the high density setting, and the least dense dataset, the rear row only under the low density setting, both are quite capable of extracting walls. You might not get points on the exact corner with the lower density cloud, but this isn't a major issue because when digitizing a wall, we can use points set in from the corner a bit and fillet the intersecting walls. However, when we look at the railings on the second floor of the building, it's very obvious there is no real way to reliably model these with the low density point cloud. Even when I change the width of the section I'm cutting to 1 meter or 3 feet, a shape starts to form that one could use to fit an already modeled railing to, but it's definitely not ideal. When I view the same railings in the combined high density point cloud, there is a stark contrast in usability of the data here. There is still a bit of noise floating around, but a lot of that can be removed with some intensity value filtering. And when I start checking dimensions, they are very consistent to within a millimeter or two, and there is a clear, definable shape to these railings. Of course, there is still missing data on the back, but that's to be expected as no scans were taken on that side of the railing. There is a direct relationship between the distance from the scanner to the object it's scanning and the point density of that scan on the object. If I set my scan density to 6 millimeters at 10 meters away, I can expect a point spacing of 6 millimeters on objects that are 10 meters away for that singular scan position. But if the object I'm scanning is 20 meters away, I would expect to see that density is cut in half to point spacing of 12 millimeters between points. This is because although the point density setting is often referred to in terms of point spacing related to a distance, it's actually an angular setting. When we look at a single scan inside of a Register 360 and measure distances between the grid of measured points, they land just as we would expect. With the low density setting at 10 meters away, we get a distance between points of 39 thousandths of a foot or 12 millimeters. And when we look at a scan 20 meters away from the building, we measure 80 thousandths of a foot or 24 millimeters between points. This same relationship held true for the medium and high density scans. The points measured were spaced just as the settings said they should have, no surprises. However, the point spacing of the final registered point cloud made up of multiple scans isn't as straightforward. This is because we are no longer dealing with a single scan measuring points on a given area, but the points measured from multiple scans stitched together. This brings us to the next factor we must consider. Tripod mounted terrestrial scanners generally require overlapping scans to register one scan position to other nearby scan positions in the same scan network. These overlapping points are not only used to register one scan to another, but also fill in scan shadows and increase point density. So in the previous example where you once had 12 millimeter spacing between points, you'll now have some points from the scans to the left, the scans to the right, and the scans behind you filling in those gaps. This really becomes evident in situations where there are a bunch of overlapping nearby scans, such as scanning the interior of a building, for example. The roof may be 20 meters above your scanner, which, if scanned with RTC's low density setting, means point spacing of 24 millimeters from a single scan. But considering we may have 5, 10, or 20 plus scans overlapping in the same area of the roof, those trusses that were once too far sparse to extract at a 24 millimeter spacing from a single scan can now possibly be extracted, as that spacing may have went from 24 millimeters to a density that would more closely reflect what the final point cloud would later be decimated to anyways. To better visualize this, let's look at the high density scan dataset in Register 360 and colorize the points by scan setup. The color of each point defines what individual scan it was captured from. You can see that areas open to an abundance of individual scans are covered with a multitude of different colors. There are some areas on the wall that were captured from every single one of the 18 individual scans, and these areas will have a much higher point density because of that. Whereas other areas that are hidden from all but one or two scan positions show much less diversity of colorization. In these areas, the density will be much less, and if only seen by one scan position, that density will be dictated entirely by the scan density setting and distance it was scanned from. To get some real world numbers on this, I cut out a small section of wall from each individual scan in the same area to see how many points the other scan positions were contributing. The single scan closest to the area cut out had a total of 368 points, and when I combined all of the overlapping scans for this area, we had a total of 958 points. So with the overlapping scans, we had an increase in density of 2.6x, with the vast majority of extra density contribution coming from the scans directly beside and behind the primary scan. Also, for a bit of important context, these scans were spaced 10 meters or 30 feet apart. If we were scanning inside of a building, it's very likely we would reduce the distance between scans to minimize scan shadowing and therefore increase overlap and the contribution to density from these nearby scans. Automatic feature extraction is becoming more and more prevalent in industry in an effort to reduce data extraction times. These algorithms not only require the data set they are working with to be relatively clean in terms of random error or fuzz in the point cloud, but the data must also be dense enough for the software to reliably estimate the feature it represents. If you're doing power line extraction and are only getting a couple of points to define the cross section of the cable, or have gaps in the data, there may be issues with trying to reliably extract the cable paths. Exactly how dense the data needs to be for successful automatic feature extraction will depend greatly on the feature you're trying to extract, the algorithm used to automatically extract that feature, and the settings used in that algorithm. Let's jump back into the example datasets and use Enforce to do some testing. Right off the bat, we can see a massive contrast between the densest dataset and the least dense dataset. Using Enforce, I can quite easily extract each and every power line with a couple clicks quite accurately from the high density dataset. You'll see some minor divergence in the digitized line work, but those are very easily fixed by adjusting the settings of the algorithm. And luckily for me and other Enforce users, There is an extraordinary amount of control available to you in these settings of NForce. When I switch over to the low density data set, the row of power lines off to the side has some data, and I'm able to extract partial lines for those cables after adjusting the algorithm settings, but the points cut out before the pull. And the back power lines are pretty much non-existent. There is no way to extract these automatically or even manually. The medium density data set had good density on the side power lines I was able to use without issue, but the back power lines became too sparse as you get closer to the edge of the scans. I tried adjusting the settings to increase the search radius of the algorithm, which worked to an extent, but after a while the data just wasn't there to finish the extraction process. We also must keep in mind when loosening up these settings to work with less dense data, we open up the possibility of the automatic feature extraction erroneously extracting the features. These algorithms aren't magic. They're very effective with good data, but when we try to use data that is incomplete, you open up the likelihood of running into issues. The intended use of the final registered point cloud has a large impact on the required density of that point cloud. If meshing of the point cloud is required, say for historical preservation, for example, the density of the point cloud will depend on the desired resolution of the mesh. If you're trying to digitally recreate the Great Pyramid of Giza, you will need a much denser data set if your goal is to capture cracks and fissures in each block for tracking erosion change, versus if you're trying to create a high-level overview of the pyramid that will only be viewed from a distance, say for cinematic purposes. Or if you're trying to create an exterior topographic surface, then there's probably little need for a high density scan. Would we really need a point every millimeter or two if it's just going to get decimated to every 20 centimeters on export? In fact, this would probably be an example of where one would use the least dense setting as possible, especially if the ground was bare earth and vegetation penetration wasn't an issue. However, if the surface you're trying to create contours for is now a poured concrete floor that requires elevation mapping to a resolution of a couple millimeters, this may require increasing that scan point density setting. The listed point density of a single scan at a specified distance is only valid when the object you're scanning is tangential to the scanner. So if you're scanning a wall that's 10 meters away with 6 millimeter spacing, you will achieve that spacing on the singular point of that wall that is perpendicular to the scanner. The point spacing listed is only truly valid at a 360-degree sphere with a radius of the listed distance of the density spec. For example, if we take an arc length of 1 meter that holds, say, 10,000 points, then project those onto a flat wall, the distance they will cover will be more than 1 meter, but the number of points will be the same. Therefore, the density must decrease. This really needs to be factored in when you're scanning surfaces that have a high angle of incidence to the scanner and are just getting a glancing shot to the object. If you're scanning an indented door opening, for example, the walls leading to the door will have far less point density compared to the abutting wall that's perpendicular to you. This is easily remedied by taking another scan closer to that door opening and decreasing this angle of incidence. However, if the object you are scanning cannot be scanned close up or perpendicular to, such as a rooftop, this may be a situation where a higher density scan setting may be beneficial. Quality control checks are done on registered point clouds in a number of ways. Sometimes the metrics of the adjustment process are used. Other times, walls or other well-definable features are compared against real-world distance measurements. And quite often, black and white targets are placed in the area of interest, captured during the scan process, and then also tied in to the survey control network that encompasses the control points that the scan data is aligned to. This allows one to extract the center of target from the point cloud and compare it to the coordinates as defined in the total station's survey control network. However, the sparser the point cloud is, the harder it is to define the center of the target in the point cloud. If there isn't a point directly in the center of the target, we cannot pick it and have to settle for the nearest point we can select. There are a few workarounds in the back end to deal with this, but they do add time to the QC process and won't provide as accurate results had the dataset been more dense near the target. The easy fix in the field is to simply scan the target at a closer distance or higher density setting. So if your desired density of your target was 1 millimeter and you're using an RTC, you could either scan it on the low density setting from 1 meter away or scan it with the high density setting from about 4 meters away. We've looked at 10 factors that one may want to consider when making the decision of what point density setting should be selected in the scanner when scanning. What's next? How can we make this information actionable? My recommendation for how you can use the examples and numbers we've looked at would be to try to figure out what density is required from your final dataset and work backwards from that. If you know your final point cloud will be decimated to 5 millimeters and you're expecting to have every scan no further than 5 meters from the area of interest with an average of 50% overlap, that means using a medium density setting would give you a pre-decimated cloud with a density of around 2 millimeters, depending on scan spacing and overlapping scans, which also means that using the medium density setting may be wasting field and office time since more than half of your points will be removed upon decimation. In fact, in that example, even the low density setting should provide more than enough points. And using the low density setting would cut your data file size in half and save you field and office time. If you got to a spot in your scan network where you could no longer maintain that 5 meters from the object you need to scan and can only get within, say, 10 meters, the easy fix there would be bumping up your density setting for that scan from low to medium to help fill in the gaps caused by the object being further away. Or alternatively, you could simply add in extra scans, which has the added benefit of reducing scan shadows. It will take some experimentation on your part, and unfortunately, being that there are so many factors that simultaneously affect point density, there really isn't an easy calculation one can do. But with some experience in dissection of various datasets, over time it should be fairly easy to strike a balance between creating a final point cloud that is dense enough where you can reliably extract what is needed and adding in too much data that will increase time spent both in the field and the office. Today, we mainly focused on data extraction and didn't really explore how point density settings affect registration. That question will take its own dedicated video, and unfortunately, there just wasn't enough time to try and cover both topics in one video. Hopefully, what we talked about today will give you a nudge to do your own testing and analysis and experiment in the field. And if you have already, please share your results in the comments below. I'd be very excited to hear when you found using a low density setting provided sufficient results, or when you needed to use a high density setting and what the determining factors were. Thank you all for watching, and as always, subscribe if you want, like if you feel it's warranted, and I'll see you next time.